as with Matthew McCormick, Robert Gregg Cavin is a philosopher who is skeptical of the resurrection of Jesus. Like McCormick, he eschews the prospect of muddying himself in the trenches of history by dealing with the actual historical evidence, preferring instead to cast down objections from his philosophical ivory tower. Cavin's case against the resurrection is not so much an argument that it did not happen, as that it would be impossible for us to have any evidence for it, even if the Gospels are 100% true, and even if the resurrection actually occurred. As he says, I shall argue in particular that because resurrection entails the transformation of a corpse into a supernatural body, our only sources of potential evidence, the New Testament Easter traditions, do not provide sufficient information to enable us to establish the historicity of the resurrection, even on the assumption of their complete historical reliability. Now, if you have a similar reaction as I had when I first heard this, then you are wondering how Cavin can possibly sustain such a thesis. After all, if the resurrection happened, then it was a historical event and should be capable of being justified by historical means, right? But Cavin disagrees. To understand why, we must first be clear on the distinction between a resurrection and a resuscitation. A resuscitation merely involves a dead body returning to life, but the body will continue to age, to deteriorate, and eventually to die again. This is not what Christians believe happened to Jesus. As Stephen T. Davis puts it, when the Jewish disciples of Jesus spoke about his resurrection, they were not claiming that he had simply come back to ordinary earthly life. This is what we would call resuscitation. Think here of the prophet Elijah raising the widow's son from the dead, or of Jesus bringing Jairus' 12-year-old daughter back to life, or of Jesus raising his friend Lazarus from the dead after he had been 4 days in the tomb. In all of these cases, the person is miraculously brought back to life. Eventually, however, each of them would die again. By contrast, a resurrection involves being raised back to life in an incorruptible, glorified body which will never again see death. This is what Christians believe happened to Jesus. But just here, we must stare down Cavin's argument, for Cavin contends that all of the evidence that we do have, and, indeed, all of the evidence we could ever have, will not be able to distinguish between Jesus being resuscitated and Jesus being resurrected. As he explains, now from this brief review of the concept of resurrection, held by those who claim that there is sufficient historical evidence to establish the resurrection of Jesus, it is clear that the hypothesis of the resurrection is not to be identified with the comparatively weak claim of revivification. 1. Jesus died and afterward he became alive once again, which is strictly neutral between the hypotheses of Jesus' resurrection and resuscitation. Rather, the resurrection hypothesis is logically equivalent to the much bolder claim. 2. Jesus died, and afterward he was transformed into a living supernatural body. Correlatively, it is clear that those who claim that the New Testament Easter traditions are sufficient to establish the resurrection hypothesis are claiming not merely that there is sufficient evidence to establish one, but, quite significantly, that this evidence is sufficient to establish a much stronger hypothesis too, and, in consequence, the specific dispositional propositions it logically implies. But now, while one may be established through sense perception, this is quite impossible in the case of two. Now we might respond to Cavin in broadly two ways. In the first place, we might suggest that we are, for the moment, merely arguing for the thesis that Jesus was raised by God from the dead, and simply leave open the question of whether or not this was a resuscitation or a resurrection. Even if Jesus' being raised back to life after 3 days was merely a resuscitation, we can still argue that it was miraculous. After all, when people are resuscitated after being pronounced clinically dead, this typically happens as the result of CPR, defibrillation, advanced airway management, and within a few minutes of death. Even in the most extraordinary case of a medical resuscitation on record, Velma Thomas was revived 17 hours after being pronounced clinically dead. We simply have no reason whatsoever to believe that someone who was dead for 3 whole days, without any medical attention, could have been resuscitated naturalistically. This is especially so given the particularly brutal nature of Jesus' death. Add to this Jesus' prediction that he would return to life as a divine vindication that his message came from God, and I think that we have more than enough reason to conclude that Jesus returning to life was a miracle, regardless of whether it was a resurrection or a resuscitation. As Stephen T. Davis puts it in his review of Cavin's article, it seems to me that most Christian apologists for the resurrection, like me, are only trying to establish the rational credibility of belief in one, which, of course, describes a miracle that is big enough in itself. Cavin argues as follows: it is clear that those who claim that the New Testament Easter traditions are sufficient to establish the resurrection hypothesis are claiming not merely that there is sufficient evidence to establish one, but, quite significantly, that this evidence is sufficient to establish the much stronger hypothesis too. Well, the truth of this claim depends on what is meant by the resurrection hypothesis. If we mean the entire Christian doctrine of the resurrection, Cavin is right. But if it means something like God raised Jesus from the dead, it is not true. I think the New Testament Easter traditions are sufficient to establish that claim. And J.P. Holding adds, is Cavin's demand that we can't be sure Jesus really resurrected unless we're able to be sure he didn't die of old age in 1300 AD? The pose is a curious one, since a Jesus who comes back from the dead to die of gangrene hundreds of years later has already undergone some sort of miraculous recovery, which begs an explanation and is contrary to what is possible in Cavin's materialistic worldview. And this is all we really need to establish in making the case for Christianity. We have a miracle which confirms the truth of what Jesus taught. But once this has been appreciated, then we must also realize that one of the things which Jesus taught was that he was going to be resurrected. So, as long as we can establish that Jesus returning to life was a miracle, functioning as a divine confirmation of his teachings, we have evidence for Jesus' resurrection. To be sure, the historical evidence would be supporting nothing more than that Jesus was at least miraculously resuscitated. But coupling this fact with Jesus' teachings, which were confirmed by that miracle, we are more than warranted in concluding that Jesus was not just resuscitated, but was also resurrected. As William Lane Craig explains, given the religio-historical context of Jesus' own radical self-understanding and blasphemous personal claims, not to mention his activity as a miracle worker, exorcist, and herald of the inbreaking of God's kingdom, God's raising Jesus from the dead is most plausibly understood as God's ratification of those claims. Cavin does anticipate this move, but his response is difficult to take seriously. He objects that we cannot trust Jesus' testimony on this point because it's conceptually possible that other factors might explain this. As he says, it is conceptually possible that a very powerful evil spirit or a group of technologically advanced but unscrupulous aliens brought about the resuscitation, ascension, and glorious appearances of Jesus, either forcing him against his will to lie about the resurrection, or else tricking him into believing that it had actually occurred by enthroning him after his ascension in a fake heaven. I must admit that I am a little taken back at finding this level of argumentation from a qualified philosopher in the opening chapter, no less, of a book which is ostensibly supposed to provide a serious challenge to the resurrection of Jesus. Cavin has offered us nothing more than the bare possibility that Jesus might have been wrong. But what needs to be shown is that this is more probable, or at least as probable, as that he was telling the truth. It is possible that we were all created 5 minutes ago, complete with memories and food in our stomachs. Yet few take this to be a reason to consider this possibility very likely. It is possible that we are living in the Matrix, or as victims of Descartes' evil demon, and that the external world does not exist. Yet few consider this possibility reasonable to believe. Possibility comes cheap. It is always possible to create a highly elaborate and ad hoc story to get around any body of evidence. But by doing so, one ratchets up the complexity of their hypothesis and correspondingly lowers the likelihood that it is true. The fact that Cavin can tell a highly complex alternative story about how Jesus might have been resuscitated and then falsely claimed that this was divine proof of his resurrection does not even begin to make that story a serious contender to the resurrection hypothesis. Again, Craig correctly points out, the objector seems to think that the Christian apologist needs to be able to deduce logically from the evidence that, for example, Jesus could have survived cholera or an automobile crash. But that's not the way an inductive argument works. For any data set, there will be an infinite number of hypotheses that are consistent with the data. In inferring that Jesus was raised from the dead in the full Jewish sense of that term, one is inferring to the best explanation of the data. As a second point, from the historical evidence alone, we are able to conclude that Jesus' body possessed different abilities after he was raised from the dead. He is able to simply vanish and reappear at will. He is able to walk through closed doors, and so on and so forth. While these special abilities may not supply evidence that Jesus' risen body was specifically incorruptible or immune from aging, they do supply evidence that it was not just a normal human body. And if we accept this, then this should increase our credence that Jesus' risen body possessed other special abilities, such as those of a resurrected body. As Richard Swinburne says, the resurrection of Jesus was a resurrection in which Jesus had supernatural powers to pass through doors, etc. I argued in the previous chapter that Jesus did claim a divine status, and coming to life again with supernatural powers, Jesus would at least be showing that he had a supernatural status, and that is some of the way toward showing his divinity. Holding adds, it is certainly true that we have no direct evidence that Jesus would not have been able to be destroyed by a hydrogen bomb and so on. However, the direct evidence Jesus provided functions as circumstantial evidence that he would have been able to survive such attempts. In any case, Cavin's whole discussion seems a bit hypothetical. I am fairly confident that he himself does not believe that Jesus was actually raised from the dead, but that this was a mere resuscitation. Indeed, I don't know of any skeptic who believes this. For this reason, my suspicion is that this whole line of argumentation from Cavin is one big smokescreen intended to distract us from the question of what he actually believes happened on that first Easter morning. If he started defending that over against the idea that Jesus did rise from the dead, rather than quibbling over precisely how far the historical evidence allows us to go, I have a feeling that things would go very poorly for him. For the record, when Cavin has ventured to comment on what he actually believes happened, he suggests the ludicrous idea that Jesus had an identical twin brother who was mistaken for Jesus after his crucifixion. So it's a small wonder that he prefers to quibble over how far exactly the historical evidence will allow us to go, rather than defend the twin brother hypothesis. But even just taken on its own, Cavin's case against rationally believing in the resurrection strikes me as extraordinarily weak. It feels like a trivial semantic argument which leaves the substantive underlying issues completely unaddressed. To sum up, this section has considered Robert Gregg Cavin's case that historical evidence alone is indeterminate between the possibilities of a resurrection and a resuscitation. I have offered two general lines of response. First, I have suggested that even if Jesus was only resuscitated, this would still be miraculous, and would, therefore, still support the truth of Christianity. And from this, it follows that we would have reason to believe that what Jesus taught was true. Jesus taught that he was resurrected, therefore, even if the historical evidence alone only allows us to infer a miraculous resuscitation, we can pretty easily move from this to a miraculous resurrection. Second, Jesus' resurrected body demonstrated abilities far beyond those of a natural body. This renders the idea that Jesus' risen body possessed other special properties, including those of a resurrected body, fairly plausible. Together, I think that these points are sufficient to show that Cavin's case against believing in the resurrection of Jesus may be readily dismissed.